All right. Good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for being here and welcome to my lecture recital. Today, I'm going to talk about the music of Daniel Flores Diaz. Daniel Flores is an Ecuadorian composer and ethnomusicologist from the indigenous community of Otavalo, Ecuador. He started his musical training at an early age and eventually moved to the capital city of Quito, where he studied classical guitar and composition. Daniel obtained a bachelor's degree in pedagogy in the University of Manabí, and like many Ecuadorian composers, he studied the music of canonic Western composers as well as the traditional Ecuadorian rhythms like the pasillo, San Juanito, Yarabí, among others. And even though he was a proficient composer in these styles, it didn't take long for him to realize that he didn't feel identified by this music. Eventually, he would obtain a scholarship to study a master's degree in composition at the Frédéric Chopin Conservatory in Paris, France, and simultaneously obtain a second master's degree in composition in the Conservatory number 8 of Paris that was geared towards more avant-garde or more modern language of composition. Being born and raised in Otavalo, one of the folkloric capitals of the country, he was in deep contact with indigenous arts. Growing up, he realized that unlike other art forms, where the indigenous community is widely represented, in music there is barely any representation of indigenous or pre-Columbian cultures, which is why Daniel, finding a calling in ethnomusicology, finished his studies by getting a third master's degree, this time in musical investigation in the University of Rioja. After studying the works of many different musicologists, he realized that there was a big misrepresentation of what is commonly known as indigenous music in Ecuador, and eventually decided that the answers he was looking for could only be found by studying the music of the indigenous community firsthand, a decision that would change his career and his compositional style forever. If we look at the history of the traditional music of Ecuador, we can find hundreds of papers and books on Ecuadorian music that define a genre that comes from the European waltz called pasillo as an example of indigenous music. And like this, many other heavily European-influenced genres are catalogued as indigenous music. While it is correct to call these genres traditional Ecuadorian music, and they form a well-deserved part of the Ecuadorian identity, and the last thing I would do is to say otherwise, these genres are completely ignoring the indigenous concepts and beliefs of music that we will discuss today. During the years of colonialism, the Spanish crown pushed Christianity among the indigenous cultures of the country, converting almost entirety of the coast and mountainside of Ecuador, as well as the biggest cities in the Amazons to Catholicism. During these times, indigenous artists were forced to paint religious art, and indigenous musicians were forced to perform European instruments. We're going to see a few examples of the art of these periods throughout Latin America so that we can have a visual example of the process of mestizaje in the arts. In this first example, we can see clearly how when the indigenous communities were turning into Catholicism, they related their gods to the gods of the Catholic Church. For example, we can see, first, the two main gods of the indigenous religions were the sun Inti and the Pachamama, which means Mother Earth. In this painting, we can clearly see how the Virgin Mary is coming out from the mountain. Also, we can see how there's a representation of the sun in the top. However, for the Catholic Church, this was frowned upon, and it was eventually forbidden. So the indigenous artists would have to find ways to disguise their beliefs into these arts. And a way that they did this is to cover the shape of the mountain in the dressings of the Virgin Mary. Most of the time, these dressings would be either brown to represent the color of the mountains or golden to represent the color of the sun, as we can see in the next example. If you take a closer look, you can see the shape of the mountain is still there with the dressing. You can also see this big maternal figure in the Virgin, that it's also a representation of the Mother Earth, right? Also, you can see clearly the colors of the sun, and like how in the back you can almost see like the sun is right there, right behind her head. This was made by an anonymous author from Ecuador. All right, the next example is similar. You can still see the shape of the mountain. You can still see that maternal figure and the colors of the sun. This was another anonymous author from Peru this time. In the next example, there's a statue of the Archangel Saint Michael from the Museum of the Conceptas in Cuenca, Ecuador. Clearly, you can see he's still wearing the colors of the sun, and in the blade that he's holding, you can see the shape of a lightning. Similar to North European mythology, for the indigenous people of the Andes, the lightning represented justice. This was also made by an anonymous artist. And by the way, something really important about all this art is that whenever we see this type of art from the 17th or 18th century, it's most of the time made by anonymous authors, which means that they were actually indigenous people that were not allowed to put their names into the art. In the last example, we can see this is one of the biggest churches of the country, the Iglesia de la Compañía de Jesús in Quito, Ecuador. And we can see how in top of the altar, there is a sun right there. It is hard to know if this was actually a device used by the Catholic Church to attract these people from the indigenous communities, or if it was an indigenous artist, because at the time it was very popular, very common that the indigenous artists were the ones who were doing all this handwork. However, it is difficult, again, to be 100% sure if that was the case, because in case that it was an indigenous artist, the one who did that, he wouldn't have been able to keep his name on the work. All right, just as we saw in the examples, in music was no different. To show my point and to give context to the work of Daniel Flores, I've chosen briefly to talk about the Yaraví. Yaraví is an important musical genre and perhaps the most indigenous influenced genre among the popular music in Ecuador. I've chosen to talk about the Yaraví because by taking a closer look at the different subgenres of Yaraví, we can clearly see the process of mestizaje and how two cultures collided, eventually leaving us a rich musical expression that is an emblem of the Ecuadorian identity, yet it is misbelieved to be an example of indigenous music. Yaraví is a musical expression that musicologists claim to come from an ancestral musical genre called Harawi. The name Yaraví comes from the words Aya, that means death, and Ayu, that means to talk in the indigenous language. And it got this name because it was often performed in funerary processions. The Yaraví is related to two other musical genres. First, we can take a look at the Harawi. The Harawi was a musical genre from the Inca Empire. It was sung traditionally by women during the months of harvest. Its lyrics were written in Quechua, the language of the Inca, and often talk about everyday activities of the communities. The Harawi was also sung or performed in the quena flute at different communal gatherings, as it became one of the most popular genres of the Incas. The songs and intonations of the Harawi would slightly change from community to community, and there are still a few communities that perform them. However, they're becoming harder and harder to find. We will listen to an example of Harawi in a second, but first let's discuss its related genres. As we discussed before, in the years of the conquest, the Spanish were actively promoting Christianity into all art forms. As a result, European instruments were introduced into almost all musical genres. With the introduction of said instruments, the European well-tempered tuning became a standard. And this is how the Harawi turned into Yaraví. Often performed in guitar and a guitar-like instrument called the requinto, it adopted the pentatonic minor scale as it was the closest to the sentiment of the indigenous chants. The Yaraví is traditionally written in a 6/8 time signature and performed with a larghetto tempo marking. Its lyrics changed from Quechua to Spanish, and even though the first Yaravís were sung in funerary processions in the indigenous communities, eventually its lyrics and the social function of these songs would change as they started to become a part of a more westernized world. The third genre is called albazo. As a way to form or promote Catholicism, the church would commission Yaraví music to be performed in the Catholic festivities. These new Yaravís were faster and had a more celebratory feeling. As the name Yaraví comes from two words in the Quichua language, they felt the need to rename it to Albazo, a Spanish word that comes from alba, that can be translated to sunrise, but it's also the name of the clothing that the Catholic priests wear to preach Mass. Now let's listen to a couple of the examples of this music. All right, this is an example of the Harawi or Karawi. I don't know if you were able to catch that, but at the beginning it said the name of the performers, and their last name was Perez and Contreras, which are like the most Spanish last names you can possibly think of. This happened because whenever the Spanish landlords would go to these communities and start building, they were like hire these people to take care of the land, and then they would have to adopt the last names of the landlords. All right, now we're gonna listen to actually one of my favorite pieces and a song that is very popular, one of the most popular Yarabis from Ecuador. Just as another fun fact, it's between popular musicians, it's common to say that you'll play the Yarabi with a fugue of albazo, kind of in reference to the prelude and fugue from the European cultures. The Yarabi would be performed as the prelude and the albazo would be performed as the fugue, even though it is not a fugue by any means. But just keep in mind what you just heard, and then how different this genre that is also called, believed to be indigenous music, is going to be.
no tiene ningún consuelo, no tiene ningún halago. Por eso cuando me quejo mi alma parece cantando, mi alma se alegra y llorando. Llorando mis pocas dichas, cantando mis desventuras, cantando mis desventuras.
Well, after this is a repetition of the Bears, and then I'm gonna just show a little bit of the Albazo.
Mala suerte tienen los pobres, que hasta los perros ya andan mordiendo. Así es la vida, guambrita, ir por el mundo bonita, siempre sufriendo. Así es la vida, guambrita, ir por el mundo bonita, siempre sufriendo.
Okay, well, I think this is also a great example of how the guitar just became such an important part of the culture, and it's not only of the folklore. It's not only of Ecuador. It's like the same case with like a lot of different countries around the world. I'm guessing that most of you didn't understand the lyrics, but they're usually very sad. Most of the time, they spoke about just how difficult it was to be a member of the indigenous communities at the time, and like how difficult their lives was. The Albazo would eventually move, like it started like by being just a faster version of the Yaraví, but eventually it would start to be performed by like larger music ensembles, and it just like really adopted a more like festivity kind of like spirit, and it would be performed almost exclusively at celebrations of the church. After mass, people would go out and like dance and like enjoy this music. However, it is very different from the indigenous music that we just listened to. As a matter of fact, I think it's probably one of the best examples of mestizaje. But it's usually misbelieved to be like purely indigenous music. And this is just one example. Again, the Yaraví is probably one of the genres that have like the most influence from the indigenous communities. But if we listen to any other of these so-called indigenous music, we will find even bigger discrepancy in most, if not all of these genres. I don't want to move forward before acknowledging that Ecuador is an extremely diverse country that has many different and rich musical expressions. Mestizo and Afro-Ecuadorian music are just two examples, to name some, from a wide range of cultural expressions that we can find in the traditional music of Ecuador. However, in this lecture, I'm going to address the music of the Andean region of the country. Big misconceptions are found in the music of the Andes. Okay, so big misconceptions are found in what we know for Andean music. And this is something that the composer Daniel Flores addresses extensively in his works. Now, he's not the first composer to come up with the idea to look at indigenous music to find inspiration for his compositions. Like him, many others have attempted to do this. A big example of this is found in the works of Carlos Bonilla Chavez, who, probably following the steps of other Latin American composers like Antonio Lauro from Venezuela, decided to investigate the folklore of his country to bring something new to his compositions. Bonilla adopted what is universally believed to be one of the most distinctive characteristics of the music of the Andes, the pentatonic scale. And based on this scale, and what he thought were the sonorities of the Andean music, he wrote some of the most important repertoire in the history of the classical guitar of Ecuador. I'm going to perform a section of a piece written by Bonilla so that we can hear what the idea of Andean music was. I've performed that piece many times, and a lot of people tell me, "Oh, that sounds like a cowboy movie, like a song from a cowboy movie." And I know how many of you are actually trying to figure out from which Western movie you recognize this music from. But that is exactly the point. For a composer like Daniel Flores, even though he values this music and performs it often, this music wasn't representative at all of his identity. And like this, there are many other famous compositions that imitate this type of pentatonic music with looking for the sound of the Andes. In reality, the whole concept of pentatonic music is a European device. In the indigenous communities of the Andes, the tuning system would change slightly from a community to another, and I can promise you that none of them was well-tempered tuning, just to begin with. And they would divide the octave by different amount of intervals. In all the years that Daniel has been spending living in these cultures, with these cultures, he has not found a single example of pentatonic music. Quite the opposite. Actually, some of these communities divide the octave by up to 22 different intervals. Now, there's some regions of the Andes, whether it is Ecuador or Peru, or any other countries from the region, where some communities do find some tuning systems that are similar to the pentatonic scale. But in reality, the way you should think, we could think about it is that they had like pitch areas where more than 3 notes, or maybe 3 or 4 notes would exist. And these areas were kind of like similar to places where the pentatonic scale works, right? The first musicologists that studied this music believed that the indigenous people were just simply not capable of performing music consistently, and they were playing out of tune, or they thought that they were not even able to build 2 different types of flutes that are going to sound, 2 types of flutes that are going to sound similar. So a lot of them just decided to say like, oh, they play pentatonic music, which is like, I'm not able to do it in tune, which is completely not the case. If you study this music profoundly and you like take the amount of time like Daniel did, where he just spent enough time to realize that all these speeches were coming back. They were playing out of tune exactly the same way every single time. So it's not that they're playing out of tune, it's that they have a different tuning system. All right. So now that we have a better context and we can understand where Daniel is coming from, let me show you why I think his work is probably some of the most important work in the ethnomusicology of Ecuador. When Daniel finished his education and went back to Ecuador, he started living with the communities of the Andes and learning about their music. One of the first things that he learned is that in the mentality of the people of the Andes, music has a deep philosophical nature. The indigenous composers would write or improvise music that would reflect their ideological or religious beliefs. And I think that was the first lesson that he took for his music writing. During this time, Daniel started writing pieces that he would entitle Runa. The first of these pieces was written for the classical guitar, and is a piece that I will be performing tonight. Just like the indigenous music, this piece has a strong philosophical nature that would influence the composition style directly. Runa can be translated to man. However, for the Andean mind, the whole nature of the word man, or the whole nature of being a man, if you will, was much deeper than what it is for the Western world. Runa is an aware man. Runa is a man that understands his connection with the community and with the world, really. Remember, for them, God wasn't an invisible being that was looking over us. For them, God is the very ground that we're stepping in, the sun that is warming us, the earth that is feeding us, which makes them much more connected to nature and to being a part of a bigger picture. Runa is all about being aware of who we are and what we are a part of, which is a fitting name for a piece that he wrote in this journey of rediscovering his identity, and also a concept that would become essential for the form of this piece. Right off the bat, one of the things that sets this piece apart from most pieces is its form. You see, for the mentalities of the Andes, music, dance, and poetry are exactly the same thing, so much so that they only have one word, the word taki, to describe them. So in the piece Runa, Daniel looked at the dance rituals of the indigenous community and based the form of this piece in these dances. The dance he wrote about is performed in the winter solstice during the Inti Raymi, or the celebration of the sun. Let's see a short section of these dances that he based his music from. All right, sorry about the sound. There is a lot of wind in the Andes Mountains, as you can tell. This is just the beginning of the dances. They would have offerings in that circle that you can see, and then eventually they stop, and then they have like a speech where they say thanks to the sun for like the harvest and everything, and then they start dancing in a circle just like that. Now there's like many different types of dances where they have like a lot of like really like athletic dance steps, and like the whole choreography is like really beautiful and like in all sorts of ways. But for this dance specifically, is just really a really easy dance. It's meant for people from the community to be able to participate in them, no matter how old or young they are. So basically, if you can walk, you can be a part of these dances. Let's see just a really short example. All right, so these dances were performed from sunrise to sunset, and eventually after the whole ceremonial part, the rest of the community is invited to participate, and it adopts a much more celebratory feel to it, as we're going to see in a second. Oh, by the way, this man right there who's wearing this costume is very important for the folklore. It's called Ayauma. It's basically, the person who's going to take this role has to meditate for many days and kind of like get possessed by the power of nature, and then eventually is going to wear this costume to repel the evil spirits for the coming year. So I don't know if you were able to catch that, but somebody kind of like gave a call in right before they turned around. The concept of infinite was really important for the communities and for the art of the Andes. And that was represented in the way they would dance in circles, and also members of the community do these dances until they can no longer keep going, and then they would get out and then will be replaced by other members of the community. And that way, they would be able to dance from sunrise to sunset. That would happen with the music too. The musicians would play until they can no longer go and then be replaced by other musicians. All right, as we can see in the score, there are different sections. They are divided by a cue similar to what we heard in the dance right before. They changed the direction of the circle. And each section has a different type of character, as we can see in the next example. Some of these sections are very rhythmical and dance-like. Now let me demonstrate really quick. All right, so all the time we find this cue. It's usually staccato. There's a staccato marking on top of it. And sometimes these cues would give kind of like a preview of what the style of the section is going to be. So for example, in here, that's for the one of the sections. The next section, the cue would be this. And then another dance-like section. But remember how I said that the meaning of the word runa was going to be a crucial part of the form of the piece? Well, in some section of this music, we can see the influence that the composer had when he was exposed to the more impressionistic language in France, when he was studying in France. We have a calling for that. That would be something like this. Again, always staccato. And in 2/4. And then the more impressionistic section. There's another section of the piece that is also how this impressionistic feeling. Now, there's other sections where he writes some more guitaristic music. Music that it's more like notes are decided for how easy they are to play in the fretboard more than necessarily a musical choice. That is something that a lot of composers struggle with when they first switch from being guitar performers to write for the guitar. But in this case, he did this intentionally, just to show how big of the guitar as an instrument is for his identity. So we can see a section like this, right? Where probably the most obvious choice for the way his fingers are. right? It's more about how easy you can play them in the guitar, and how you can just go all over around the fretboard, more than a musical, way of finding notes. All right, now this piece is really intense for being so short. It takes us through a wide range of colors and characters. In this music, we can clearly see the introspective journey that the composer is taking us through, but the form might be strange and difficult to understand for the Western ear. But it's actually much more similar to the forms of the Andean music. However, it was the first of these compositions with this approach, so he still uses a pentatonic and modal language. But some of the sonorities of his music are much more similar to the sonorities of the music of the people from the Andes. The main characteristics that he really took from the Andean music is the sense of organization, the changes, and the form, and the lack of a good cadential ending. Actually, the whole ending of this piece does not sound like an ending at all. You see, the whole concept of a cadence is also a European device. For the indigenous, just like dance, music was infinite. The sections of this piece have no defined order. We can start or finish anywhere. And of course, for programming reasons, we can't do this. But if this piece was performing an idealistic world, I would be performing it and then do more variations at different sections until I can no longer go, and then somebody would come and replace me. So there's really no ending of the piece. Now, this is the first of these sets of runa pieces, and I think he's barely scratching the surface of what would later become a much deeper language. The last piece he has written is actually a commission I made. Now, when I commissioned this piece, I asked him to go all in and write like basically whatever he wants, and to take his language as far as he wants to go with it, with no consideration whatsoever what I like, because I think that's the way you should commission a piece, right? And he delivered. This piece is unfortunately not complete yet. We're very close, but there's still many things that we need to work on and things that he still has to teach me. This is a complete new language for me, and a language that has never been done in the academic world yet. However, for this lecture, I asked him to send me some sections of the piece so that we can get in deep into his influences and understand this music better. And this is what he had to say about this piece. All right. Repetition is a fundamental characteristic of the Andes mind, and it's tied to the cosmos and the sense of rotation and translation of the earth. Each repetition is a new cycle of life, and that is in constant movement. Each new cycle has elements from past, present, and future. Now, it's important to know that the people from the Andes actually have a very advanced knowledge of the cosmos. They have calendars that are much more precise than the one that we use, and they were able to see the rotation and the movement of the earth around the sun by looking at the stars, like before the Spanish really came and educated them. All right, this is the foundation of the form of this music, right? So we can see how the rotation of the earth is represented by the repeats in each measure, and the translation of the earth is represented by a measure that keeps going longer and longer, as we can see in the examples over there. In the Western world, we have a strong sense of beat that is embedded to a time signature. For the Andean world, however, the sense of beat is different, and in many of the folkloric music, the beat can't be adjusted to a countable rhythm. Measures of groupings tend to prolong and create a gap in the beat, as we can see in these measures. Another characteristic is that the melodic phrases repeat for a determined number of times, but these repetitions themselves are a part of a bigger section that is repeated as well. In some communities, this usage of repetition can create really complex forms that can be really difficult to recognize for a more traditional listener. However, for them it comes naturally. Keeping in mind that these pieces are performed without any type of score, it is really impressive it is a really impressive feat to witness. And again, as we mentioned before, music is infinite and can be repeated indeterminably, until a second performer replaces the first and a third replaces the second, and so on and so forth. So in these examples, we can clearly see a much different musical language than what we're used to. I'm just going to perform some of them so you can get a feel of how this displacement of the beat occurs. All right, so that is just an example of how much different this piece is from what we're used to hear. And well, now I'm going to perform the first piece that we discussed. It's called Runa, by, again, Daniel Flores Diaz. thinking about not